There comes a moment in every ambitious person's life when they face an impossible choice: remain liked by everyone and accomplish nothing meaningful, or accept that real power requires disappointing people who expect you to prioritize their comfort over your objectives. Most people never reach this crossroads because they spend their entire lives avoiding decisions that would force such a choice. But for those who do arrive at this moment, everything hinges on what Niccolò Machiavelli understood better than anyone. The day you choose power over people's approval is the day you stop being ordinary. Machiavelli didn't write The Prince to help people become more popular or well-liked. He wrote it to explain how actual power works, not how we wish it worked. He who wishes to be obeyed must know how to command, he observed, recognizing that command requires the willingness to make decisions that some people will hate. The leader who needs everyone's permission before acting isn't a leader. They're a hostage to other people's comfort zones. This choice between power and popularity isn't a one-time decision, but a fundamental orientation that separates those who shape events from those who react to them. It's the difference between asking, "What will people think?" and asking, "What needs to be done?" Once you understand this distinction, you can never go back to believing that effectiveness and universal approval are compatible goals. The transformation that occurs when you prioritize power over people's feelings isn't about becoming cruel or indifferent to others. It's about accepting that leadership often requires making decisions that benefit the whole while disappointing individuals who preferred the previous arrangement. Machiavelli knew this wasn't a moral failing. It was a practical necessity for anyone serious about creating change rather than simply talking about it. The illusion of people-pleasing power. Most people believe they can accumulate power while keeping everyone happy. That influence grows through consensus and universal agreement. This belief creates one of the most persistent illusions in human behavior: that you can lead effectively without ever disappointing anyone. Machiavelli would have recognized this as the thinking of someone who has never actually held real responsibility for consequential outcomes. The vulgar crowd always is taken by appearances, and the world consists chiefly of the vulgar, Machiavelli wrote, understanding that most people judge leaders based on how those leaders make them feel rather than what those leaders actually accomplish. This creates enormous pressure to prioritize appearance management over results management, to focus on maintaining relationships rather than achieving objectives. The people-pleasing leader operates under the assumption that everyone's interests naturally align, that conflicts result from misunderstandings rather than genuine disagreements about priorities and resource allocation. They believe that with enough communication, empathy, and compromise, every stakeholder can walk away satisfied with every decision. The people-pleasing approach to power seems attractive because it avoids immediate conflict and preserves short-term relationships. The manager who seeks consensus before every decision, the entrepreneur who tries to satisfy every stakeholder's concerns, the leader who apologizes for every tough choice. These approaches feel more humane and collaborative than Machiavellian directness. But Machiavelli understood what people-pleasers discover too late. This approach doesn't eliminate conflict. It simply delays and amplifies it. The leader who avoids disappointing anyone in the short term creates larger disappointments in the long term when their indecisiveness produces poor outcomes. The entrepreneur who tries to satisfy contradictory demands from different stakeholders ends up satisfying no one and failing to build anything sustainable. The illusion persists because people-pleasing sometimes works in low-stakes situations where the cost of indecision remains minimal. You can maintain universal approval when the decisions don't matter much, when the resources aren't scarce, when the timeline isn't urgent. But the moment you face genuinely consequential choices, where different people have conflicting interests that can't all be satisfied, the people-pleasing approach reveals its fundamental inadequacy. Machiavelli observed this pattern repeatedly in Renaissance politics, where princes who tried to avoid offending anyone ended up losing their principalities to those willing to make hard choices. He who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner affects his ruin than his preservation, he wrote, recognizing that good intentions without effective action lead to failure, regardless of how nicely those intentions are expressed. The modern workplace provides countless examples of this dynamic. The team leader who won't make decisions that might upset anyone ends up with projects that drift endlessly without clear direction. The executive who seeks unanimous agreement before moving forward discovers that unanimous agreement often means settling for the lowest common denominator of ambition. The psychology of choosing power. The moment you decide to prioritize effectiveness over approval, something fundamental shifts in how you perceive relationships and responsibilities. Machiavelli understood that this shift isn't primarily about changing your behavior toward others. It's about changing your relationship with other people's emotions and expectations. Before this transformation, other people's disappointment, anger, or disapproval feels like a judgment on your worth as a person. Their negative emotions seem to indicate that you've failed in some essential way, that you need to modify your actions to restore their approval. This psychological framework makes you reactive rather than proactive, constantly adjusting your decisions based on other people's emotional responses rather than objective requirements. After choosing power over people's approval, their emotional reactions become information rather than instructions. You still care about people and consider their feelings, but those feelings don't determine your decisions. You recognize that someone's disappointment with your choice doesn't necessarily mean you made the wrong choice. It might simply mean that your choice conflicted with their preferences or interests. This psychological shift requires what Machiavelli called the ability to imitate the fox and the lion. The fox represents cunning and strategic thinking, the capacity to understand how your decisions will affect different people and to anticipate their responses. The lion represents courage and strength, the willingness to proceed with necessary actions even when you know they'll generate opposition. The person who chooses power over people develops both qualities simultaneously. They become more aware of how their decisions affect others, not less aware, because they need to anticipate and manage reactions strategically rather than simply avoiding them. But they also become less controlled by those reactions, because they understand that leadership often requires accepting other people's temporary displeasure in service of longer-term objectives. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent to human suffering or callous about other people's legitimate concerns. Machiavelli wasn't advocating cruelty for its own sake. He was recognizing that effective leadership sometimes requires accepting responsibility for decisions that cause short-term pain but prevent larger long-term problems. The parent who enforces bedtime despite their child's protests isn't being cruel. They're prioritizing the child's long-term health over the child's immediate preferences. The surgeon who operates despite the patient's fear isn't being indifferent. They're prioritizing the patient's survival over the patient's comfort. The leader who implements necessary changes despite employee resistance isn't being heartless. They're prioritizing organizational health over individual convenience. Understanding this psychology helps explain why many people never make the transition from people-pleasing to power-focused thinking. The transition requires accepting responsibility for other people's negative emotions without being controlled by those emotions. It requires developing tolerance for being temporarily misunderstood or disliked by people whose long-term interests you're actually serving. The strategic advantages of power priority. When you stop needing everyone's approval before taking action, several strategic advantages emerge that people pleasers can never access. These advantages compound over time, creating increasingly large gaps between those who prioritize effectiveness and those who prioritize universal likability. First, you gain speed in decision-making that consensus seekers cannot match. Machiavelli understood that the wise man does at once what the fool does finally. While others are still gathering opinions, building consensus, and managing everyone's feelings about potential decisions, you're already implementing and learning from results. This speed advantage proves crucial in competitive environments where delayed decisions often become wrong decisions. The entrepreneur who spends months trying to design a product that satisfies every potential customer's stated preferences discovers that the market has moved by the time they launch. The leader who waits for unanimous agreement before addressing organizational problems discovers that those problems have worsened while consensus building consumed time and energy. Speed also creates momentum that makes subsequent decisions easier. When people see that you make decisions promptly and effectively, they begin expecting decisiveness rather than endless deliberation. This expectation reduces the pressure you feel to justify every choice extensively, creating a positive feedback loop where effective action becomes easier over time. Second, you develop clarity about priorities that people pleasers never achieve. When you're not trying to satisfy everyone simultaneously, you can focus resources and attention on objectives that actually matter rather than spreading them across every stakeholder's wish list. Machiavelli noted that a prince must imitate the fox and the lion, for the lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. This wisdom applies to resource allocation. You need the fox's cunning to identify which objectives deserve priority, and the lion's strength to pursue those objectives despite competing demands for your attention. The person who tries to please everyone typically accomplishes less than someone who focuses on pleasing the right people for the right reasons. The business that tries to serve every possible customer serves none of them particularly well. The leader who tries to address every concern simultaneously addresses none of them effectively. Third, you gain respect from people who matter more than you gain resentment from people who don't. Machiavelli observed that, since it is difficult to join them together, it is safer to be feared than to be loved when one of the two must be lacking. People respect leaders who make tough decisions more than they respect leaders who avoid decisions to preserve relationships. This respect proves more valuable than popularity because it's based on demonstrated competence rather than personality appeal. People might like the agreeable person who never challenges them, but they trust the effective person who delivers results even when those results require uncomfortable changes. The respect that comes from effective action also proves more durable than the approval that comes from people-pleasing. Popularity based on keeping everyone happy disappears the moment you're forced to make decisions that benefit some people at others' expense. Respect based on competent leadership survives temporary disappointments because people understand that effective leaders sometimes make unpopular decisions for good reasons. The cost of avoiding the choice. Many people spend their entire careers trying to avoid choosing between power and people's approval, believing they can somehow achieve both simultaneously if they're just clever enough about managing relationships and communications. Machiavelli would have recognized this as the thinking of someone who doesn't understand how power actually operates in competitive situations. The cost of avoiding this choice isn't simply missed opportunities or slower progress. The cost is remaining perpetually dependent on other people's permission to act effectively. When your ability to make necessary decisions depends on maintaining everyone's comfort with those decisions, you've given other people veto power over your effectiveness. This dependency becomes particularly costly when dealing with people whose interests conflict with necessary changes. The employee who benefits from organizational dysfunction will never enthusiastically support reforms that eliminate their advantages. The competitor who profits from market inefficiencies will never approve of innovations that threaten their position. The stakeholder who gains from the status quo will never voluntarily endorse changes that reduce their influence. Waiting for these people to give their approval before implementing necessary changes means waiting forever. Their resistance isn't based on misunderstanding that better communication can resolve. It's based on conflicting interests that no amount of relationship management can align. Machiavelli understood this dynamic when he wrote, "Politics have no relation to morals." He wasn't advocating immorality, but recognizing that effectiveness sometimes requires actions that some people will consider wrong for reasons that serve their interests rather than objective principles. The avoidance strategy also creates internal costs that compound over time. When you consistently subordinate your judgment to other people's comfort levels, you gradually lose confidence in your ability to make independent decisions. You become psychologically dependent on external validation rather than developing internal criteria for evaluating choices. This dependency makes you less effective even in situations where consensus might be achievable, because you're constantly second-guessing yourself and seeking confirmation rather than trusting your analysis and proceeding with implementation. The person who can't act without everyone's approval becomes unable to act decisively, even when that approval is available. The moment of transformation. For most people, the choice between power and people comes in the form of a specific situation where these priorities directly conflict. You're forced to choose between making a decision you believe is correct and maintaining relationships with people who oppose that decision. The moment reveals whether you'll prioritize effectiveness or approval when you can't have both. Machiavelli faced this choice repeatedly during his diplomatic career, watching Florentine leaders fail because they tried to avoid offending powerful interests rather than making decisions based on what Florence needed. He saw firsthand how leaders who prioritized maintaining relationships over achieving objectives ended up losing both relationships and objectives when their indecisiveness produced poor outcomes. The transformation occurs not in the decision itself, but in how you think about the decision. Before the shift, you experience the choice as a moral dilemma. How can I do what's necessary without hurting people I care about? After the shift, you experience it as a strategic challenge. How can I achieve the necessary outcome while managing the human consequences as effectively as possible? This reframing doesn't eliminate concern for other people's welfare. It clarifies your responsibility toward that welfare. Instead of letting other people's immediate emotional reactions determine your choices, you take responsibility for making choices that serve their long-term interests, even when those choices conflict with their short-term preferences. The moment of transformation often feels isolating because you're accepting a level of responsibility that most people avoid. You're acknowledging that effective leadership sometimes means being temporarily misunderstood by people whose interests you're actually serving. This isolation is part of what Machiavelli meant when he wrote about the loneliness of command. But the isolation is temporary if your decisions prove effective. People might initially resent changes that disrupt their comfort, but they typically appreciate the results of those changes once the benefits become apparent. The respect you gain from effective action proves more satisfying than the approval you sacrifice through tough decisions. The Machiavellilian Paradox. The deepest insight in Machiavelli's approach to power versus people reveals a fundamental paradox. Those who prioritize people's immediate approval often end up serving people less effectively than those who prioritize objective results over subjective reactions. The leader who makes decisions based on what people want to hear rather than what they need to hear often produces outcomes that ultimately disappoint those same people. The parent who avoids setting boundaries to maintain their child's approval often raises children who struggle with self-discipline. The manager who avoids difficult conversations to preserve team harmony often presides over teams that underperform and frustrate everyone involved. Conversely, the leader who makes decisions based on objective requirements rather than subjective preferences often produces outcomes that ultimately benefit people more than their initial approval-seeking behavior would have. The parent who enforces appropriate boundaries despite temporary displeasure often raises more confident and capable children. The manager who addresses performance issues directly despite initial discomfort often builds stronger and more successful teams. Machiavelli understood this paradox when he wrote that it is far safer to be feared than loved. He wasn't advocating cruelty, but recognizing that respect based on effective action serves people's interests better than affection based on avoiding necessary decisions. This paradox explains why many people who claim to prioritize others' welfare actually prioritize their own comfort with others' emotional reactions. They avoid making decisions that would upset people, not because those decisions would harm people, but because they can't tolerate the temporary disapproval that effective decisions sometimes require. The person who truly serves others' interests develops the courage to accept their temporary displeasure when necessary. They recognize that real care sometimes requires making decisions that people won't initially appreciate, but will ultimately benefit from. The transformation complete. Once you've genuinely chosen power over people's approval, you can never fully return to the mindset that prioritizes universal agreement over effective action. The transformation changes not just how you make decisions, but how you understand the relationship between leadership and responsibility. You recognize that real leadership often requires protecting people from the consequences of their own preferences when those preferences conflict with their long-term interests. You understand that effectiveness sometimes demands accepting responsibility for outcomes that please no one initially but benefit everyone eventually. This understanding separates you from those who still believe that good intentions and universal approval are sufficient for achieving meaningful results. You've learned what Machiavelli knew, that the world doesn't operate according to how we wish it worked, but according to how it actually works. And effective action requires accommodating reality rather than expecting reality to accommodate our preferences. The person who completes this transformation doesn't become cruel or indifferent to others. They become more strategic about how they help others, more realistic about what help actually requires, and more willing to accept the temporary costs of providing genuine assistance rather than just emotional comfort. Machiavelli would recognize this as the moment when someone stops being ordinary and starts being capable of extraordinary achievement. Not because they've become a different type of person, but because they've accepted the responsibilities that extraordinary achievement requires. The day you choose power over people's approval is the day you stop asking permission to be effective and start taking responsibility for results that matter more than the process that produces them. Everything changes because you finally understood what Machiavelli knew 5 centuries ago. Real power isn't about getting people to like you. It's about getting important things done regardless of whether people like how you do them.